One thing that keeps coming up, and it came up as recently as with Admiral Cooling from ACT, the word budget, the word resources, the word money. Knowing this was going to be an important topic, we have the panel this morning looking at the budget. How do we use what we have more effectively? And I think that's going to be a key piece as we move to the future. You're going to hear from a panel of experts in the area, not all with the exact same message, which is good, coming at it from different ways. Heading the effort, I will tell you right now that you're going to soon see why we selected Dr. Dov Zakheim as the panel moderator. He has served in various positions in DOD from 1987 to 2001, CEO of SPC International, which is a high-tech analytical firm. 3 times received the Department of Defense highest civilian award, Distinguished Public Service Medal. He was SecDef's comptroller 2001 to 2004 under the Bush administration. I've had the privilege to be with Dr. Zakheim during some of those interesting opportunities. And he recently served as a senior vice president at Booz Allen Hamilton. Most recently, he served with the AFCEA Educational Board, so he is not unfamiliar with AFCEA International nor with the United States Naval Institute. I draw your attention to the fact, and I can say it, I'm sure he will mention it too, but in a very short time, his book entitled A Vulcan's Tale, How the Bush Administration Mismanaged the Reconstruction of Afghanistan, will hit the streets. When you think about the title and the implications of that, and you talk about our distinguished panel moderator, I offer that for your consideration of your personal and professional development. I'm going to turn the podium over to Dr. Zakheim, who will introduce his distinguished panel. I thank each and every one of them for participating today and look forward to your remarks.
Thank you very much, General. When I last spoke here, which was about 6 or 7 years ago, the room was packed. That's what happens when you're comptroller and you're handing out money. I think if Bob Hale were here today, and he's a good friend since 1975, he might have a packed room, but it wouldn't be for the same reasons. This is going to be a very, very tough decade ahead of us, and we are fortunate to have a truly distinguished panel. What I'm going to do actually is introduce each one as they come up to speak, but I want to first lay out for you some of the concerns, and these concerns are literally getting worse by the day, as you'll see momentarily. You know, Secretary Gates, I believe, pulled a rabbit out of a hat by coming up with $87 billion in cuts, which are going to begin in fiscal year 13, which is next fiscal year, and moved $100 billion around, and people thought he had done a pretty good job of it, all considered. And then, if the press reporting is accurate, he was caught by surprise when the administration came out with a 12-year, $400 billion national security cut. Now, national security could also include Homeland Security, and Admiral Cohen, who's going to speak next, of course, was an undersecretary there. It could include the Department of Energy, but most people feel, and probably correctly, that most of that money is going to come out of DOD. Well, yesterday afternoon, the Senate Budget Committee came out with a mark for a $900 billion cut, and not over 12 years, but over 10 years. So that gives you a feel for the kinds of pressures we're talking about. Now, these are not likely to go away for a whole bunch of reasons. Perhaps, to my mind at least, the biggest reason is that our interest rates right now are exceedingly low. But our national debt is sufficiently high that for every 1% increase in those interest rates, you're talking about roughly a quarter of the DOD budget, equivalent. Since our interest rates are near zero, and since historically they've been around 4%, you could, in effect, wipe out the entire DoD budget just by paying interest on the national debt.
That's just an example.
That's just an example.
Navy.
This gives you a sense of the scope of the problem. And so the question then becomes, well, what do you do about all this? How does it affect programs? How does it affect priorities? We know some programs are clearly a problem, but we don't know how to solve them. Defense health being the classic example. This year's administration request is for $52 billion just for defense health, which is more than most countries' defense budgets entirely. What do we do differently? What do we do if you're the chief of naval operations and you've got Aegis destroyers that are coming in? The DDG-51 is roughly $2 billion. The Virginia-class submarine is roughly $3 billion. Tridents are roughly $5 billion, and carriers are north of $10 billion and heading further north. What do you do when your shipbuilding budget's only about $14.5 billion? And this applies across the board to all the services. So there are a lot of questions to be answered, and as I say, we have a terrific panel to do it. We're going to start with Admiral Jay Cohen, a Navy Academy grad, an engineer of the First Order, Woods Hole and MIT. I'm not sure you can do much better than that. A submariner. He survived Rickover. Chief of Naval Research, overhauled it completely, and tells me that there's a book coming out about that overhaul relatively soon. Undersecretary for Science and Technology at the Department of Homeland Security, now a principal in the Chertoff Group, and a senior consultant and a board member, and I think a great person to kick off this panel, Admiral Cohen.
Well, good morning, and Dr. Zakheim, thank you so much for including me, and I'm honored to be part of such an august panel. I thank Naval Institute and AFCEA, two incredible organizations, which are only better when they come together for putting on this conference. And I know you've had many, many distinguished speakers. Because Dr. Zakheim brought up the fact that I had command of the Hyman G. Rickover while he's alive, I'll share just one story with you, especially because we have Royal Navy and other navies here today. When I took command, I got the crew together and I said, you know, when you think about how submarines are named around the world, Conqueror, Vengeance, Vindictive, names designed to strike fear in the heart of the enemy. I said, crew, you are serving on the only commissioned ship in the world named to strike fear in the heart of its own crew. So they got it. They never let me down. Let me run through, because Dr. Zakheim asked us to talk for about 3 or 4 minutes, and your questions are far more important than any pontification I might have. But let me just run through a potpourri very quickly of items to wet your whistle. And I must tell you, Dr. Zakheim painted a fairly bleak picture. When you think about that glass and half full of water, an optimist says it's half full, a pessimist says it's half empty, and an engineer says it's over-designed. So, the truth is somewhere in between. And I know he was not proposing to zero the Navy budget. That was just an example. So I've served both in Department of Defense, Navy, Department of Navy, and had the honor of serving in Department of Homeland Security, and now I'm nominally in industry and have enormous respect for what you all do. So defense, when I went from defense to Homeland Security, I assumed Homeland Security was DOD Light, L-I-T-E, and that defense did the away game and Homeland Security did the home game, and they met maybe at the 12-mile limit. Maybe it was like a handshake between the Coast Guard and the Navy. I was dead wrong, and I'm not the Fonz, I can say wrong. The metrics in defense are kill, capture, or destroy, generally over there without regard to forensics, because the battlefield moves on. It turns out the DHS issues not from DOD, it issues from the Department of Justice. all of the operating components, Border Patrol, TSA, Coast Guard, are actually law enforcement agencies. And what are the metrics? You watch Law and Order on TV. The metrics in law enforcement are arrest and conviction. And if you don't have the forensics, if you don't have the evidence or you compromise it, you may make the arrest, but you don't get the conviction, you don't get the promotion. And we operate in the homeland under the Constitution and the Fourth Amendment, unreasonable search and seizure. So this was a real eye-opener for me. And so as we dealt with industry, and so many of the big industrial giants in defense said, well, you know, we've got this technology, it's a throwaway. We've got the Joint Tactical Radio System, JTRS. We'll just do JTRS Light or Predator, and you can fill in the blank. What I found was the funding is fundamentally different in DHS. And first of all, DHS is less than 1/10 the annual budget of defense, and it primarily goes to personnel. Primarily goes to personnel. And so what I found as I went around the country and I dealt with first responders is I'd say, I'm here from Washington. I'm here to help. And he'd be their pumper or whatever, you know, and they'd say, oh, Admiral, thank you so much. If you really want to help, buy a raffle ticket or a muffin, because that's how we fund our radios, our pumpers, et cetera. And there's been great frustration in large industry. So I've burned up half of my time. And so let me just say, as a really old guy, I would tell you that past is prologue. I lived through post-Vietnam. I lived through the Berlin Wall coming down and the peace dividend. And I would tell you, in my humble opinion, post-Iraq and post-Afghanistan, we will not be in recapitalization. We will be in reconstitution. And those Strykers will come back, and those H-60s will come back, and those F-15s will come back, and they will go into depots, and they will be stripped for all of the corrosion and maintenance that needs to be done. And those companies that can bring the glass screens and the fiber optic backbone while those devices are disassembled, but they bolt into the existing holes, are going to prosper. And those that try and convince DOD that F-22 is the solution to a rising China, you know, my humble opinion, I don't have stock in anybody, I think are going to be challenged. And I've got wonderful Air Force people here, so, you know, I'm sure they will calibrate me. I'd like you to think about the 3 M's as we go forward. Mission, means, and money. What will define the budget talks, I believe, because Dr. Zakheim has this, I believe, exactly right, and there's no surprise here, and it's bipartisan. The Congress and the President in this election season, and we are in the re-election season, are in a horse race to show who can drive the deficit down the farthest and the fastest. And you understand that defense is the largest discretionary portion of that. And so there will be an effort for the services to define their mission in a post-Iraq, post-Afghanistan world. Once they've done that, they then will link the means, the devices, the tools, the manpower, the technology to accomplish that mission. But if you think of this as a Venn diagram, you got this big circle all around that, or a small circle, and that's the money. And so all of this will be designed to cost, and cost will be a key driver, in my humble opinion. Army may be closest to getting this right with their motto, Army of One. I don't know if that's the final answer, but you know, et cetera. And I will close by giving a naval example. You heard Dr. Zakheim talk about the cost of ships. Now, President Eisenhower, in my opinion, didn't have it quite right when he talked about the military-industrial complex, and there's been a lot written on this. It's really the military-industrial political complex. And politics is about votes, and votes are about jobs, and jobs are about constituents. And so when the Congress appropriates $13 to $15 billion a year for ship construction Navy, they leave it up to Navy to determine the right kind of ships, the number of ships, et cetera. You can see from the numbers that Dr. Zakheim used, it's not inconceivable that at $12 to $15 billion, if that stands, we're looking at potentially 6 ships a year. You can do the math, times 30 years the size of the Navy, but we have 6 major shipyards. So we have all the overhead at every shipyard working on one ship, a one-to-one correspondence. These are going to be very, very challenging times. So the real question of this panel was, how do we control? How do we best use the money? And I would tell you something I was not successful in, and I don't think we're successful today, is how do we control requirements? How do we prevent change orders? How do we keep our eye on the prize of getting the most capability for the least money without disturbing industry as they go forward? And as operators, we have been insatiable in our desire for higher, faster, better, et cetera. Without the internal discipline in the services, in the requirements process, I'm not optimistic, even though I'm an old engineer, that we're going to get the best bang for our buck. So I look forward to your questions, and again, thank you so much for being here.
Well, thanks very much, Admiral Cohen. You can tell his focus was very much on culture. And one thing for you all, because that's really the key to this, how people think about what they're supposed to be doing. One thing for you all to think about is that for the past decade, we have had a culture of spending more money. And the people who are now senior and relatively junior officers have never been in the kind of environment that we're about to enter into. And so that raises a question, how do you change the culture? And maybe that's something we'll talk about. Our next speaker is, again, someone who's been in this business a long time and kind of seen them come and go, but from a different perspective. Raymond Haller, Senior Vice President and Director of MITRE's C-Cubed-I, federally funded research center, longtime MITRE executive. Hasn't just worked in the C-cubed and C-squared areas, also had some Navy work, and another engineer. So he's watched the ebb and flow of defense programs from a slightly different perspective, and I turn to him now to tell us a little bit about where he thinks things are going and what we should do about them.
Thank you, Dr. Zakheim, and thanks to FC and the Naval Institute for having me here. It's really an honor for me to speak to you on this, at this amazing time in our country's history. I'm taken by Admiral Jim Stockdale's comment about surviving difficult circumstances, and he has a philosophy that I've sort of internalized myself, and that is one of the things you have to do is to confront the most brutal facts of your current reality. So in that context, let me just say a few things about what I see as our reality in this business. It has to start with the national debt, 96% of GDP currently, and growing sharply unless we make changes. This 96% number, I'm told, starts to approach the point of instability, as Dr. Zakheim said, where the interest on that debt will go up, or could go up, which would have a additionally catastrophic effect on our overall discretionary spending. The annual deficit is $1.6 trillion against a budget of $3.8 trillion, the federal budget. That means we're borrowing over 40 cents on a dollar for every dollar spent. As part of all this, you can't help but see in the papers the average annual medical cost inflation is double about the overall inflation rate. And with baby boomers, of which I'm one, about to retire, and increasing Social Security and Medicare expenses associated with that, you can see there are other huge demands on the federal budget, in addition to the defense. Speaking of defense, so we've had 13 years of real growth at about 6% annually. That means we've doubled the budget over the last 13 years from $350 billion to over $750 billion. This is all in constant dollars. I had a mentor who once said, then your dollars should be outlawed, and I agree with that. So, of course, and all this is in the context of a protracted global economic slowdown. And the last thing I'll say about the DoD budget is somebody once explained to me how if you look at it in constant dollars over about 70 years, it has a very nice sinusoidal behavior. You know, I never can get this right. Let's see, the 70s were a bust, the 80s were a boom, the 90s were a bust, the 00s were a boom. So what's going to happen in the teens? Any guesses? So we're due, even absent the federal debt issues and all of that. The last thing I'll just tell you in terms of confronting the facts is our current spending in constant dollars is almost as high as it was at the peak of World War II. So at the same time we find ourselves in this situation, the military faces just tremendous additional continuing challenges in the global security environment. Sweeping change across the Arab world, WMD-enabled nation states and proliferation of that technology to others, including non-nation states, violent extremism, with my own personal sense that I think it's coming closer to home again, and we read in the papers this morning about how bin Laden really wanted to continue the kinds of attacks that were seen on 2001. Russia is reasserting itself. We have ongoing cyber vulnerabilities. China is significantly increasing its military capabilities and focusing on things like anti-access, anti-space, cyber operations. You have transnational criminal organizations that are rising in capability to being almost like state actors, and you have super-empowered individuals and groups, all of which, you know, the Department of Defense will be called upon to respond to, as it has been in the history of the country. In the meantime, we also have to recapitalize things like our fighter force, our tanker force, our SSBN force, and long-range bomber force. And so you sort of have this perfect storm. One of the questions we were asked to say is, so how do we envision this $400 billion that has been put out on the table over 12 years to be cut? And I would make the same observation that was made earlier, which is I think that's become a floor now. So we can expect cuts, in my view, of that as a minimum, with the negotiation being between the $400 billion over 12 years and the $900 billion that was put out yesterday over a 10-year period. So very, very significant cuts to the Department of Defense. What programs are most vulnerable was another question that was asked, and I guess I would say, I don't know. I think there will be some program cuts, but I don't think that's what it's really going to be about. One of the ways you can get insight into what might happen is to look at the President's Deficit Commission reduction panel. And they put in $100 billion cuts illustrative over the FIDEP. And it's a potpourri of things, of which cutting programs is only a small piece. Some of the other things that they speak about are overhead savings, reductions in sort of headquarters staffs and that sort of thing, reducing overseas bases, reducing contract services, and I'll say more about that in a second. Reducing or modernizing health care within the department and for its retirees. So speaking of contract services, the CSIS just put out a study in May, a very, very interesting study that analyzed DoD spending, and for the first time ever, as far as I can tell, the contracting for services is about equal to the contracting for products. So the way I've heard it talked about, the department spends roughly $700 billion a year. Say $300 billion of that is spent on personnel costs and sort of internal to the department, and $400 billion a year is spent on buying things. Half of that, $200 billion, buys stuff, fuel, airplanes, ships, and the other $200 billion buys services. this is going to be cut, in my view. One of the big areas that I think Secretary Gates has already started to look at, I think the designated new Secretary Panetta will also look at this. And Secretary Van Buren and the Air Force AQ talked recently at a session where he said the Air Force plans to cut its A&AS support contractors by an amazing 74% over the fight-up, as an example of the kind of things that I think we can see. So I don't imagine that, I think Secretary Carter is trying to preserve procurement of things for the department to enable it to do its mission. I think things like tooth to tail, which was a phrase from a past decade, will be back in vogue. Strategic relevance is going to be the acid test. So in my business, the information business, I think what are some of the ways that we believe we can help save money? I think you see a lot about 804, Section 804, IT acquisition reform initiatives. There is real money to be saved there with IT consolidation, and I think the new DoD CIO is going to push very hard on that. I want to mention portfolio management. I think that's a critical thing in a downward budget environment. Yesterday, somebody mentioned Pareto efficient. I think there's a concept in portfolio management called the efficient frontier. It's a fabulous concept that says if you're on the efficient frontier for any given amount of expenditure, you've optimized your portfolio in terms of performance or return. And I think that's something the department will embrace by necessity. In general, there's a lot of technology that will help with cost savings in at least a portion of the budget. I'll give one example, which is bistatic radar, which has been around for a long time, is making a comeback. It turns out with advanced signal processing, bistatics can do the kinds of jobs that previously very large aperture, very expensive radars could only do. And so now you see 2 order of magnitude reductions in what it might take, for example, for a ground moving target radar capability. In another area, I'll mention mashups and composable capability on demand and the kinds of applications that you see flourishing on an iPhone or on a Droid and that sort of thing. A new sort of software development paradigm, I think, offers the department tremendous potential. And then look at Watson, the Jeopardy computer, tremendous talent there. So let me summarize. I think in adversity, as General O'Denaro said, there is opportunity. The department will protect capability acquisition, I believe. We'll see increased innovation, streamlined processes, more jointness, whole of government, and a lot more multinational partnerships, improved acquisition program outcomes, leveraging technology innovation from the private sector as well as coming out of the DoD labs, and in general, a strengthening and preserving of our information advantage. And I want to leave you with a quote from a colleague of mine, Lieutenant General retired Barry Knutson, sort of a plug for information. He who uses information best wins. I look forward to your questions.
Well, thanks very much. I think you've heard some interesting suggestions as to what might be done in place of major weapons systems cuts. A note of caution, and this may be something we want to debate, during the downturn of the 70s and again of the 90s, it wasn't weapon systems that were really cut back as much as, particularly in the 70s, when you wound up with a hollow army more than anything else. And so how you cut O&M as opposed to whether you cut O&M is a major issue. And when you have a situation where the department doesn't really even know how many contractors are working for it, how do you get at a problem when you don't even know its size? But maybe our next speaker will help us out. He is, after all, a comptroller. Dr. Jamie Moran is the Air Force Comptroller, Assistant Secretary for Financial Management. And before that, he was on the staff of the Senate Budget Committee. And so he's watched these problems from both sides of the river. He has a BS from Georgetown, I guess School of Foreign Service, is that correct? A master's in public administration from a place that I went to school at for a while. That's the London School of Economics. A doctorate from Yale, so he's one smart guy. And most important of all is experience in grappling with these problems. And so and I use the word problems, challenges is much too nice a word. not when you're talking about the kinds of budget cuts we're talking about. They're problems. And so I look forward to hearing your perspectives on just how the Air Force, and if you want to go beyond the Air Force, fine, but I doubt you will, how the Air Force is looking at the kinds of issues that our previous two speakers have just raised.
Well, thank you very much. Thanks for the introduction and for the opportunity to be here. Those of you that have been reading your program know I'm standing in for my good friend and colleague, Lieutenant General Chris Miller, who is the head of planning and programming for the Air Force. You've got somebody who's shorter, less distinguished, and I'm afraid less good looking. But the emphasis is shorter. He's really, it is, we come from pretty much the same perspective, though, and we're able, I think, to speak to some of the same issues here. Today is, I think, an opportunity for me to share some of how the Air Force is thinking about grappling with the change in direction of the budget, how we're grappling with the more austere resource environment, how we're grappling with the need for efficiency and also for strategic choices. I think that the coming austerity, if that's the right word, is going to force us to change how we do business. It's going to force us to change how we do business in our planning, in our programming, in our budgeting, and in our execution. And so at every stage, we've got to think about, do the existing processes, do the existing people, do the existing ways of doing business still make sense? There's a lot of engineers in this audience. I'm a comptroller, so I'm a little intimidated. And frankly, you know, comptrollers are a pretty dour lot. We don't have our own jokes. I wanted to, though, riff, if I could, on some of my more distinguished colleagues here and say, you know, for a comptroller, when we look at a glass and we look and see if it's half full or half empty, we don't look at whether it's over-designed like an engineer. We look at whether we've got container excess to need that can be taken in the year of execution for an offset. Similarly, you know, when we think about the world at large, we've got to focus on that bottom line. But we also know that if our numbers don't add up, unlike those of you in the engineering business, we can go back to the Congress with a supplemental request. That's a lot harder if you're in flight on an airplane. In January, Secretary Gates reminded all of the services and the nation, really, that maintaining American leadership in the world was going to require fundamentally changing how we do business. He said in June, he set a challenge to us, June of last year, to find ways to increase our funding for mission areas, to find ways to increase funding for modernization, force structure, readiness, at the expense of some of our support activities. This is an exercise that consumed the Pentagon, as probably all of you are well familiar. It was a vital first step, and it helped to build some of the muscles that we'll need to continue to grapple with a coming age of austerity. The Air Force worked this really hard. We were given a $28.3 billion target. We ended up submitting over $33 billion in potential tail-to-tooth efficiencies. That was, I'm proud to say, the largest share of TOA of any of the services. And if you think inter-service rivalry is dead, it's alive even in the efficiency world. But that was not an easy task. And it was not easy, again, coming back from a management perspective, from a process perspective, from a bureaucratic structures perspective. But it helped us build some initial muscles that we're going to need. As we in the Air Force look to deal with our fiscal challenges, deal with our fiscal problems, as Dev said, I've been focusing on a handful of key principles. Like any principles, they are not written in stone, they're not locked in, they are guides to action. But they're the sorts of issues we're trying to keep at the top of our minds as we handle this situation. They're based primarily on my reading of history, and again, in an audience with a lot of engineers, I have to confess my PhD is in political science, so it's not real. But my work was on budgeting for defense in times of drawdown. So after 13 years of irrelevance, it's really good to have marketable skills. So from looking at the history of U.S. defense budgeting and strategy from really the post-World War II period on, I've identified a handful of principles. Take them for what they're worth. The first one I've laid out is we've got to try to move smoothly. When we've radically shifted the direction of the department, whether it's upward or downward, whether it's the Weinberger Reagan buildup, or whether it's the post-Vietnam drawdown or the 90s, pick any of those sine waves. When we've radically shifted, we've done damage. We've done damage to the department's purchasing power. In those periods, we've seen greater inflation, greater cost inflation in the things that we buy. We've done damage to the industrial base. We've done damage to the fundamental readiness or capability of the services. That is a significant risk, and we do it either way. It's the radical push or pull on the rudder that is going to that drives a lot of that. You know, since 2001, defense inflation, the defense deflator, has grown by about 1% a year more than economy-wide inflation. And just like our lunch is being eaten by healthcare costs growing significantly above economy-wide costs, the same is true in defense. That gap in the inflation rate means that we are buying less for the money we put in. And again, to steal a joke or steal a line, while it may be much more reasonable to talk in terms of constant dollars when you're analyzing policy, if you try to go to your bank to deposit a constant dollar or use a constant dollar to pay your credit card bill, you're not going to have too much luck. I mean, if that Series 2001 $20 bill in your wallet, I'm afraid they're still only going to give you $20 worth of goods for it. But we've got to watch that issue, and we've got to, in a drawdown, we've got to seize the advantage we can from the reduced pricing power. We as government have to seize the advantage we can from the reduced pricing power that our diminished demand gives to industry, while hedging against the increased costs that could come from inefficient industrial base and other issues. So first principle, move smoothly. Second principle, find opportunities wherever you can to convert fixed cost elements of your operation into variable costs. Classic tool in business. And this is a hard issue for the services. In many cases, our savings from terminating or scaling back a particular activity are very limited because we can't deal with some of the underlying costs. And some of that is politically constrained. In the absence of a BRAC, shutting down bases is obviously very hard. But there's a lot of other reasons. And here's a case where we can apply some of the lessons we've learned from our overseas operations, from fighting the two wars, to the peacetime operations of the department. Again, just speaking from an Air Force perspective, the Air Force has become very good at precisely tailoring deployment packages. An air expeditionary wing at one place does not necessarily look like another one, and we've moved individual augmentees and small teams to do all sorts of things. But when it comes to a domestic base, we have basically 1,000-person open-the-door package, and we haven't really figured out how to tailor that very well. Again, we've got to figure out how to convert our fixed costs into variable costs. A third principle, we need to figure out how we can convert free or public goods into priced goods, internal to defense resource decision making. This is not easy, and it doesn't apply everywhere. But there's a lot of cases in defense where we ask one service to provide something or one defense agency to provide it, and the others are simply consumers of it without any pricing mechanism. There's other cases where it's very different. In transportation, for example, we use a working capital fund and we charge users, and that creates a feedback loop. You look at your requirement for transportation and you see if it makes sense. We've got to look at that in other places. Now, I'm not talking about putting a slot on every GPS receiver and requiring users to drop quarters in. I mean, we've got to be smart about this. But as we look at acquisition of specific capabilities, as we look at further refinement of existing capabilities, we've got to think about how to bring pricing concepts into that so that the requirements system and the acquisition system have a good way of making trade-offs. A fourth point is that we need to think about how we can curb excessive optimism and wishful thinking. And this is a huge challenge in periods of drawdowns and historically has been. Again, very clear parallels in the commercial sector. In periods of budget constraint or revenue limitations, the tendency is to find clever ways to get around problems, clever financing mechanisms and the like. And the other tendency is to adopt overly optimistic estimates of what it's going to cost to do something. This has been a core focus area for me and my great team at the Air Force Cost Analysis Agency, making sure that as the Air Force makes resource decisions, we are accounting for the most likely costs, looking at them hard, and then managing them down rather than engaging in sort of wishful thinking at the get-go. It's tough to do, but we've made some significant strides. Two final principles. I think we need to treat our military equipment as precious and as assets that are consumed by use. Now, we need to train, we need to build readiness, but we also need to recognize, to take the example of the F-22 that's been cited, the nation is not going to build more F-22s. The nation is going to, it would be a long time before we built a follow-on to that aircraft. That aircraft has a fairly specified life. Every hour we use it, we are depleting that capital stock. That's a capital stock that we have a limited supply of, and it's a capital stock that our allies are not going to be able to provide. So we've got to keep an eye on that and use it for core training. Don't do things like fly two F-22s against each other for air-to-air training when you know you're not going to employ them against one another. And that's an issue the Air Force has been working now. The final point is the cultural point, and that others have raised it. The Assistant Commandant of the Marine Corps had a great line about this. We've got to recognize that billions are a series of millions, and millions are a series of thousands, and we've got to build the culture that focuses on each and every dollar. And again, the structures of the department have a hard time doing that, and the folks in leadership positions in the department, by and large, were not in leadership positions during the last drawdown, don't have as much of a sense of what needs to be done to make those tough choices. There's no easy solution, but we've got to keep working on that. You know, at some point, we'll get to the point where returning dollars to higher headquarters is not a demerit. It's viewed properly, and sometimes even higher headquarters might think about returning dollars to the U.S. Treasury. If they can't be executed on a high priority, we oughtn't necessarily execute them on simply an executable priority. Look, above all, we can't shirk our duty to manage. The department has laid out a lot of serious efficiency proposals. If we're going to achieve them, we've got to focus on them in detail. And we've got to focus on them with an eye to outputs as well as inputs. It's not just about dollars, it's about producing a defense establishment that can meet the national security strategy, protect the nation for the long run. I think that's a tough challenge, but I think that the leadership of the department is taking it seriously, and I'm very proud to support them. And I hope that we can rely on the broader defense policy community to support us as we do it. Thank you all.
Well, thanks very much, Secretary Moore. I do have to respond to one remark you made, which troubled me, that comptrollers have no jokes. Bob Hale, the current comptroller, told me about this guy who went to see a doctor, and the doctor says, I got bad news and good news. What do you want first? He says, tell me the bad news first. He says, the bad news is you're going to die tomorrow because your heart's failing you. He says, well, what's the good news? He says, the good news is I've got 3 hearts you can choose from, but you need an immediate operation tomorrow morning. He says, well, what are they? He says, well, I've got a 25-year-old triathlete who died in a car accident. I've got a 26-year-old swimmer, and she died of some mysterious disease. And then I've got a comptroller's heart, and he died on the job. Guy says, all right, I'll take the comptroller's heart. And he goes home, he tells his wife the bad news and the good news, and she says to him, why'd you take the comptroller's heart? He goes, because it's never been used.
Stroke.
Colonel Doug McGregor, I think he's got a heart. He didn't necessarily show it in the Great Tank Battle of 73 Easting, about which he's written a book, and for which he was highly decorated, Bronze Star with the V for personal valor. Colonel McGregor is one of the leading iconoclastic thinkers of our time. I mean, if anybody has thought deeply and seriously about what transformation really means, it's probably Doug McGregor. Breaking the Phalanx, Transformation Under Fire, just two of the books he's written that really look at transformation in the most unique and serious ways that I'm aware of. So we're really honored to have this Army veteran who doesn't just limit his observations to his former service, who's a graduate of the Military Academy, 76, I think, right? But has a truly world view of what ails defense and has been saying it for some time. And so we look forward to hearing his views on the current situation and what to do about it. And he has not given me a commission for this plug, nor has the Naval Institute, by the way, which is publishing this, Naval Institute Press. And they, of course, together with FC, are our co-hosts, and I think are doing a marvelous job. Doug, over to you.
Well, just think for a minute. It's a book about an Army battle that only the Naval Institute Press would publish. So, it's worth reading. Listen, I'm very happy to be here today. I'm always happy to leave the Beltway. As soon as you drive outside the Beltway, people are nice to you. They smile at you. They wave at you. They're friendly to you. And there's no original thought inside the Beltway. I'm sure you're aware of that. There's a reason for that. When I was assigned in the War Plans Division of the Army Staff in 1994, one of my duties was very early in the morning to go downstairs in the basement of the Pentagon and flip a switch. This switch controlled giant microwave emitters. Now, the microwave emitters are unknown to you, but in truth, you've seen these so-called sound barriers along 495 and 66. Those are really microwave emitters. We turn them on in the morning. That turns your brain to mush. So by the time that you arrive at the Pentagon, you're incapable of any sort of original thought. We turn those things off at noon so that you can find your way home again. So that's one of the principal problems that we confront. Now, in all seriousness, the basis for my brief remarks today is an article that I wrote that is posted at foreignpolicy.com. It's called Lean, Mean Fighting Machine, Declare Victory and Go Home, How to Deal with Defense. And I recommend it to you. Now, I know some of you have read it because I've gotten your hate mail. But for those of you that haven't read it yet, you really need to look at it because it's the only thing I've seen thus far that actually systematically goes through the general purpose force structure and cuts both force structure and personnel, hence the hate mail, as you can imagine. And I'll talk a little bit about that. Now, before I go into the three areas I want to discuss, I want to reinforce what Dr. Zackheim said at the very beginning. I actually anticipate a much more profound downturn in the economy than I think most people do. I don't personally see any evidence for a recovery, and I think in the aftermath of the next presidential election, strangely enough, we're going to see another fiscal crisis, another bubble burst, and I think it will be hell to pay, to put it bluntly, economically inside the United States. Now, inevitably, somebody in the audience says, well, who the hell are you? You know, you're not an economist. Who are you to say this? Well, John Kenneth Galbraith, an economist, once said, economists exist to make astrologers look professional and competent. So, I am completely at ease predicting disaster. And the point is very simple. That is those of us in the military establishment, the people that lead the military establishment, are going to have to work closely with the civilian leadership to find ways to make significant reductions in defense, because you know that long before someone attacks the Ponzi scheme that we have in Washington, D.C., known as Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security, they're going to go after defense. We absolutely have to deal with it. And it's going to be uncomfortable for many, many people because it's going to compel change. And that's really one of the themes. I think this is an opportunity, frankly, to make virtue of necessity, to reshape the force, to move in new directions. I don't see a major conflict between great scientific industrial powers for at least 10 to 15 years. Could be wrong, been wrong once or twice before, but I think it's unlikely. It's unlikely because the rest of the world, ladies and gentlemen, is in terrible condition. I know that sounds strange, but they really are. China, which is referred to as this rising power, there is incidentally a new China threat industry inside the Beltway that's developing very, very rapidly. That threat industry, I think, is misleading for the simple reason that there are 800 million people inside China who live in abject poverty and about 400 million who live very much like you. This is not a new development in the history of China. Remember that every Chinese dynasty has existed longer than the United States has been in existence. The Chinese have been through these booms and busts before. They've got serious economic dislocations. But there's another piece of news. They've also been very foolish in their public behavior, their public diplomacy, particularly in Asia. Not so much with us, contrary to popular belief, but in Asia. And what is now emerging in Northeast Asia is going to change the strategic equation. That's not the United States. That's an emerging Korean-Japanese military alliance, something which lots of people thought was impossible, which is now beginning to take on very real dimensions. Those two states, in terms of scientific industrial power, are enormous, absolutely dramatic and decisive in their capability to reshape Northeast Asia. In addition to that, the Chinese have managed to make enemies virtually all the way around them. Needless to say, the Indians harbor no illusions about China, neither do the Vietnamese, and clearly the Russians do not. And in those areas, we're going to see conflict in the future. And future conflict, by the way, is not going to resemble what we've seen over the last 10 years. And this is very important for everyone in here to understand. What we've been doing for the last 10 years is not the future. It is very definitely the past. It is a throwback to 19th century colonialism and imperialism. Only this time, in the American context, it is altruistic imperialism. We come in peace to help you, kill hundreds of thousands of you, incarcerate hundreds of thousands of you, destroy your economy, and then reshape your nation to suit our interests. This sort of altruistic imperialism has been a disaster. It did not start in Afghanistan or Iraq. It actually began in earnest in the aftermath of Desert Storm, when our favorite ambassador to the United Nations, who became Secretary of State, Madeleine Albright, said, "Well, General Powell, you keep talking about this wonderful military. Why won't you use it everywhere?" And we began using it, and using it, and using it, and using it. We've now just about worn it out. And by the way, we have not been fighting robust adversaries or enemies who can actually test our capabilities. This is the other great secret kept from the American people. Dov Zakheim told me not to say this, but I'm going to say it. For the last 10 years, we have been involved in the military equivalent of clubbing baby seals. There are no armies, no air forces, no air defenses, no navies, no nothing. And I have personally fought and killed Arabs. And the SEALs that I killed were at least well-equipped and organized in '91. The ones that we've been clubbing have been pathetic. Afghanistan is worse. And it has cost us $1.6 trillion, if you believe Joseph Stiglitz, the Nobel Prize winner. And it's going to cost us a lot more in the future, as has been pointed out. This is over. This is in its death throes. The future is going to be different. It's going to be different on two levels. First of all, it's going to be different strategically, because we have no interest that justifies, thank you, we have no interest that justifies, no compelling national strategic interest that justifies the commitment of our forces over the long term to build nations where none exist, to fix fundamentally broken societies that rest on the foundation of dysfunctional cultures. This is going to end. Those of you who are worried about marching into Libya, I have news for you. There is no appetite on the Hill, and there is no appetite in the United States to put a large U.S. ground force into Libya. Nor do I see any appetite in the future, much as Secretary Gates has pointed out recently in some of his public statements. In addition to that, warfare is in fact moving in new and interesting directions, and we've taken essentially a break from that. We need to go back and look at it. We need to appreciate technology, its impact, as well as social factors. In addition to the rest of the world being mired in the equivalent of 1848 revolutions, and by the way, we may see something very similar here in the United States, depending on what happens with our own economy, we are also seeing what began many, many years ago in microcircuitry, directed energy, and a host of other important technologies reach new heights of lethality. Now, to give you a quick impression of lethality, let's stop for a minute and remember that in less than 6 months during World War I, we lost 310,000 casualties, including 110,000 dead. Think about the lethality of that battlefield. We haven't seen anything like that in the last 10 years. But that kind of lethality is going to be magnified in the future, and it's going to change the way we operate. We're going to have to be capable of mobile dispersed operations at sea, in the air, on the ground. There is going to be a critical need for protection that comes in both the form of armor and passive armor capabilities as well as active capabilities. We're going to have strike weapons, and our enemies, our adversaries, our potential opponents are also going to be equipped with strike weapons. The ISR complex that surrounds this globe is going to have a more profound impact than anybody can imagine. What are we going to have to do? What we're going to have to do, as I said before, is make virtue of necessity. Make cuts, but begin to think of future forces as being organized around ISR, strike, maneuver, and sustainment, operating not under single service headquarters and single service chains of command, sometimes with a J in front to make them joint, but in fact integrative command structures, where joint force commanders with 3 stars could be from any service, commanding force capability packages from any service. This is something we've resisted for a very long time, but 2 things are driving us in the direction. One is the lack of funding that's going to be acute in the years ahead, and the second is going to be the nature of future conflict and crisis. So, what do we cut? What do we harvest? Where do we go? What do we look for? Do we stand back and say, what has been selected over the long run for extinction in the Darwinian sense? Are we going to have mass armies in the future designed to flood other people's countries with riflemen to bring them liberal democracy, which they can't spell or understand? No. We're going to have a smaller, more professional ground force than what we've seen in the past. The Marine Corps and the Army are both going to be subjected to personnel reductions, which is the polite term for significant cuts. And I recommend a 600,000-man ground force. And of course, the first people with hate mail were the Marines. You know, they sent the hate mail instantly. The Army sent a couple of people out to slash my tires, but I caught them before they got to it. You know, the Navy, when they found out I cut 3 carrier battle groups and all their support started sending me viruses through email. The Air Force got off relatively lightly, so they're only engaged in identity theft. But the point is, all of the services are going to be absolutely miserable, but you're going to live in a world dominated increasingly by submarines, unmanned submersibles, unmanned aircraft. The aerospace environment, this complex, this ISR strike maneuver complex from space, from land, from the sea, it's going to change the way we do business. We're not going to be able to concentrate large numbers of forces for long periods of time in cantonment areas. All of these things lead to the kinds of reductions that are outlined in foreignpolicy.com. So I urge you to look at them because, as I said, it's bad news. Everyone is going to be very upset. But the good news is we can make virtue of necessity and begin to develop a new force for the future that will be more potent and lethal than what we have now. Thank you.
Thanks very much. We took longer up at the podium than perhaps was planned for, but I think it was worth listening to these folks. So now we have about 15 or so minutes for questions. Does anybody want to throw any bombshells at any of the people who threw bombshells at you? Just please identify yourself and say whom you're asking the question of.
Alan Shepard, and I'm asking the question of the panel. First, Dr. Zakheim, find it very interesting to put it in terms of submarines, our national debt. $417 billion spent on interest, worked out to about $1.3 billion a day. You could build 3 Trident submarines every week and have chump change left over. We've gone from World War II, where we blew up things, to the Cold War, where we didn't, we were fear at home, back to blowing things up, and now I guess we're going to go back to where we don't. However, with Twitter, some of the other advances in microprocessors, unmanned vehicles, identity theft and stuff, how do you all see, and Moore's Law continuing to give us more bang for the buck, how do you all see the budget in the next couple of years before we get a self-sustaining national debt where it grows without us having to drive it up?
Thanks very much. I'll answer briefly. You mentioned me, but I'd like the panel to respond. This year, it looks like the budget isn't going to be that big of a problem, relatively speaking. Next year, it's going to get much worse. I think you mentioned submarines. I tend to agree with Doug McGregor. I think that's the one area that we have absolute dominance in and need to maintain absolute dominance in. I believe the Chief of Naval Operations has said that in the past. He may say that at lunchtime. When we're ahead, we should stay ahead. There are other areas where I believe that there are other countries in the world that may be slightly ahead of us. I think we have to get rid of the not invented here mentality. A country that is, 20th in education can't believe that it's first in everything. And so we need to think a lot more creatively. And I'll turn to the panel and let you hear some of their creative thoughts. Let's just go down the line like that.
I'll just address several of the things that you said, but part of this goes to Colonel McGregor's thoughts. I believe there is zero tolerance in the United States for an attack on the homeland. And when that occurs, and it will occur, the President, the Commander-in-Chief, will use the forces he has or she has available to send a message. And so while it may be Neanderthal, it may be clubbing seals, the political reality is that the American public will demand action. So that's number one. Number two, and I'm a big believer in unmanned vehicles, and I invested in it very heavily as Chief of Naval Research, and some of it's coming to fruition today. Unmanned vehicles don't vote. They don't sit promotion boards. And until we change that paradigm, I don't know the strong constituency in military leadership to acquiesce to an unmanned world. And your comment on Twitter didn't go far enough. Social networking and its interaction with cyber warfare and the ability to control that in an Arab Spring, measure, countermeasure, countermeasure, coupled with Stuxnet, we haven't begun to appreciate the implications there. Next to WMD, it is the major threat, and I salute the Air Force in their efforts over the last 2 years to try and take the lead in this, which has resulted in a DoD cyber command. But we are all ones and zeros, everything about us. That's where our national wealth is, and it is at risk every day.
So let me agree with some of the comments that have been made already. Certainly, I agree with Admiral Cohn that the nation has a very low tolerance for attacks on the homeland, and will respond a lot the way we've responded before. I think a big part of the national security spending is in the intelligence community, and the intelligence community will continue to, I think they have excelled of late at their jobs, particularly in finding and interdicting terrorist plots and high-value targets and that sort of thing. I think the wired world is huge, as has been said. Stuxnet, if you didn't understand about cyber vulnerabilities, delve into Stuxnet. It will tell you a lot about it's more than an inconvenience. The cyber world and the physical world connect in very real ways, and that can cause tremendous issues for us. And I think we will have to prioritize our defense spending to deal with these kinds of issues. I couldn't agree more with the remarks about submarines. We have they are the ultimate stealthy force, and what do they call it? The silent service. Just tremendous opportunity there. The wired world offers both opportunity and vulnerability. It's one of the things I'm very concerned about is, as I said yesterday, the cyber defense is lagging cyber attack. And so we need to close that loop, and I think there'll be budget efforts at that, and Cyber Command is a big part of that.
I'll just be brief. I think my colleagues have addressed a lot of the key strategic issues. On the math, I'm not sure I quite followed all of it, but it is absolutely right that the debt is a significant threat. We've had several citations to the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs on that. And the reality is, today, the nation is at a 60-year high in spending as a share of GDP and a 60-year low in revenue as a share of GDP. It's no surprise that we're running a massive deficit. It's no surprise that despite historically low interest rates, we're absorbing a great deal of national treasure in paying interest. One of the reasons that getting to swift resolution on this debt limit situation, this debate in Washington, is so important is that failing to resolve that promptly could drive precisely that increase in interest rates that Dr. Zuckerman talked about, which would eat our lunch almost instantly.
Colonel McGregor?
No, let's get to the questions.
Okay, fine. You are next.
Good morning, sir. My name is Frank Richardson, and I'm in trouble. I need some help. I'm a graduate of VMI and a degree in economics. I'm a retired Air Force guy, and I'm a contractor. So all three of those
I feel sorry
areas
for
of
you. You're right.
disciplines have been torn apart here this morning.
How's your football team?
Wasn't bad this year. The reason why I'm asked, I want to ask the question about, it was mentioned that Van Buren is focused on the A&AS contracts. We talked about the downsizing of the military. What role do you see now with contractors moving ahead if all the opportunities for industry support to the DOD is dramatically reducing? What do you see moving forward for industry support, whether it's people support or products and services?
I'll be very brief. I think the cuts are going to come in what are called the butts and seats world. I think the focus will be on buying things and buying ideas. And I believe that's where Secretary Gates is coming from. And there are lots and lots of ways to do that. And it will save quite a bit of money. So those companies that are simply providing people who flip their badges when they retire will well have something to worry about, in my view. Let me see what my colleagues think.
Well, I think we live in a scapegoat world, and contractors are easy to scapegoat.
Yeah, I think as our moderator said, it's all going to be about ideas and value add and strategic relevance. I mean, I think anybody who is able to contribute in that vein will continue to be very gainfully employed. If you're not relevant or don't have a value add idea, you won't. Sort of my view.
And I'd agree with Dub. I think that the butts in seats staff augmentation is really going to be a core area of focus. There's a real recognition that we've got a lot of self-licking ice cream cones going in the Pentagon right now, and in commands and staffs across the country and the world. And if we reduce manning in those staffs, there will be some operational impacts, but there will also be some efficiency advantages to the organization, the self-tasking phenomena. But if staff augmentation contracting is an out to that, it'll undo that. It'll undo that efficiency. So I would expect to see that as the focus as well.
Doug?
The military establishment is going to shrink because there is no existential military threat to the United States, nor is there going to be one for some time. And as a result, the defense industry that supports it is going to have to shrink. And that's going to be very difficult given the consolidation that people went through back in the 1990s. But I think it's going to happen. Most people involved in the defense business who invest in it feel that way as well. And the contracting industry that has grown up over the last 20 years, I think, will also begin to diminish. But this doesn't mean they're going to go away, but I think Dove is absolutely right. I've seen this repeatedly because I've done a lot of work on the military as well as the commercial side, and I am always astonished at these contracts that involve 30 or 40, 30-somethings sitting in front of computers pounding out things. And I think we're going to start asking questions about, do we really need to do that? And then someone's going to stop doing it, and we're going to discover we really never needed to do it to begin with.
Okay, this will be the last question because we have to break, so over to you.
Thank you. My name is Jeffrey Damon Capella, and I want to thank the panel for extending us the courtesy of their time. It was interesting to sit there and hear their thoughts on the challenges posed by budgetary constraints, particularly budgetary challenges that are borne out both doctrinally as well as regarding allocation of resources surrounding military research development and procurement, and those constraints, of course, coming from aptly stated U.S. military intervention as foreign policy, as well as the rise of non-military public consumption. As I stated yesterday regarding the hybrid capability, I would contend some of the Pareto optimal issues of dealing with the challenges, at least of the symptom, which is budgetary constraints, is paraphrased beautifully in the findings in a paper authored in 2008 by Christopher Mann from the National Defense University, Finding and Funding the Right Mix, where he focuses on investing in capabilities to maximize crossover between high-end and low-end missions. While all that's all very well and good, and efficiencies are indeed important, I would contend we're talking about the wrong thing. The theme of this panel centers around dealing with the symptom of the problem, which is budgetary constraints due to a lot of other issues. Rather, I would contend it would be more efficient to deal or address the problem which gives rise to those budgetary constraints defined as low economic growth and rising non-military public consumption. And to this end, the United States, I would contend, cannot afford to cut investment in military research and development. Not only does military research and development translate into additional operational efficiency realized via technological development and subsequent technological
Can I
efficiency.
ask you when you're hitting your question
I'll
mark?
get there very soon, sir. Examples including directed energy weapons and automation, which has been mentioned by the panel. It also underwrites economic growth regarding positive spillover and spin-off. So going back to the issue of addressing the problem, how are you going to... my question to the panel is this. What is the panel's thoughts in the defense establishment assisting efficiencies in other governmental agencies from which a lot of these budgetary constraints are coming from, not so much in taking over their mission role, but kind of acting in a similar manner of how the military investments in research and development have had positive spillovers in our economy in general?
Okay, I'll briefly deal with that. I think defense needs to get its own house in order first. In fact, there's a lot of concern that defense has taken on too many other missions. When defense starts mixing it up with other agencies, it becomes the default mechanism for everybody. There's a serious problem here, which we see with the wars we're fighting. Our country's not really at war, and our government is not really at war. The Department of Defense and the military people are at war, and a small percentage of the State Department's at war, and a handful in Treasury and Agriculture. That's not the way it should be. And before we start looking at other agencies and helping them out, we need to have them do what they're supposed to do so that our military people can do what they're supposed to do. That's my view.
In the area of R&D, one of the tenets, and I know that Admiral Mullen subscribes to this, is you really want to spike your investment. And you want to do that where you have overwhelming advantage. But when you do that, if my fingers are the spikes, because we live in a public absence, skunkworks world, your potential enemies are going to look at where you're investing, high energy weapons, submarines, wherever it might be, cyber. They will tend to invest where you're not investing. And they will look for disruptive technologies to basically hit you in your blind spot. And so while we spike our investment, we must be very careful to make sure that we keep the basic research and the applied research so that we have knowledge of what the technology capabilities are or potential might be, so that we don't suffer from that technological surprise. And that is a very dynamic situation. And Secretary Kendall, about a month ago, and I know him, enormous respect for him, in talking about budget priorities, said, high energy weapons, speed of light weapons, are always 5 years away. That's his quote. Well, you know what? If we don't keep them 5 years away, we will suffer from that group that puts all their eggs in that basket to give us a disruptive technology. And history, and Colonel McGregor is a much greater historian than I, is replete with this. So I don't know where R&D falls in this. You know, I think an ebbing tide lowers all boats. Okay, and we've seen this administration, it's bipartisan. But in America, we believe in the goodness of research, and I think that's an area that will continue to get emphasis.
Over to you.
Let me just commend to the audience a paper that was written called The National Security Narrative by Navy Captain Porter and Marine Colonel McElby, and it speaks about the importance of whole-of-government activity and unity of purpose across the government. So rather than viewing it as the DoD sort of taking on more, I think in a way the DoD needs to take on less, and other aspects of government, as were discussed by General Ordinary yesterday, USAID and DOS, and even having an internalized, consistent domestic and international policy are all very important to our future. And it's laid out beautifully in that paper. I would highly recommend it to the audience.
So I think it's clear that in building an investment portfolio, there's no one-size-fits-all solution. There are areas where we're going to have to focus R&D, and spikes and disruptive technology opportunities are certainly things we've got to look at closely there. We also, though, have to make sure we're not overdoing. Researching and developing for what? You know, the balance between the R&D accounts and the procurement accounts across the Department of Defense have consistently shifted over the last couple of decades to a more and more focus on R&D. And we eventually have to buy things, setting aside the S&T, the science and technology basic research part. You know, this is aimed to get capability to field to the troops. So we want to make sure we don't swing that pendulum too far, especially if you take the economic trends seriously and believe this is not a 1 year, a 2 year, or a 4 year downturn that we're entering, but rather a sustained one. The final thought I'd lay out is that if you believe that the world is going to be more competitive, more near peers, and that's obviously a debatable proposition, but if you believe that, then I think there's a strong argument for the U.S. to focus on areas where we can adopt cost imposition strategies against potential adversaries. We can't forever go down the road of we will just outspend and out level of effort you in order to secure a military advantage.
Very quickly, our top national security priority has to be the restoration of American economic prosperity, and that includes the rebuilding or creation of a new productive manufacturing base. That has to be number one. Whatever sacrifices we make should be made with that particular point in mind. Secondly, I think this is a time where we can take risk. I don't subscribe to the view that the world is full of threats. My experience in the world is limited, but I think most of it wants to do business with us, and we should want to do business with it. Secondly, we have to make the kinds of choices that my colleagues have been pointing to. We are of necessity a global aerospace and naval power. It's of necessity. It's not open for debate or discussion. We are an island. We live between two oceans, and we absolutely must dominate the aerospace environment for our own survival. We are not a global land power, nor do we need to be. That is a mistake. That must end. The imperial overstretch, which is bankrupting us or contributing to it, has got to end. It's unnecessary. The world has changed. We need to change with it.
I want to thank the panel. I want to thank the Naval Institute and AFCEA. I think they've all given you something to think about, to put it mildly.
Dr. Zuckheim, to this great panel, on behalf of AFCEA International and U.S. Naval Institute, we thank each and every one of you. Thank you for your leadership. Thank you for your service. The one thing we talked about was the uncertainty of budget in whatever realm it happens to be, and we also looked at Colonel McGregor's look to the future of warfare. The cognizance of each of these areas makes the imperative for us to sharpen the focus. Us to sharpen the focus means not only government, not just DOD, but across government, as Dr. Zuckheim has said, and we need to do that globally with the United States and our coalition partners, all of whom will be key players. To each and every one of you on the panel, thank you for your service to nation in the past and today, and we look forward now to letting you have a chance to get on the floor, exhibit floor here to talk more to industry, and a reminder that the Chief of Naval Operations, Admiral Gary Ruffhead, will be our luncheon speaker at 12:30. So please be there for prompt seating. Thank you very much. Have a great day.